r/AskReddit. People who can speak multiple languages, what language do you think in? I'm fluent in English, Vietnamese is my mother tongue, speak a little French. I mainly think in English since I moved to US, but my dreams come in Vietnamese still. I know someone whose first language is Italian. He started learning English at around 4 or 5 when he moved to Australia, and has been speaking English ever since. But he only ever dreams in Italian and sometimes speaks in Italian in his sleep. It's pretty funny when he speaks it in his sleep. If I'm ever in a situation where I've heard him do it, I say shit like pizza, spaghetti, mamma mia, and he responds in Italian. My first language, Romanian second. German third, English my brain. Duck your mother language, let go with English. Does it switch around or is it mostly just English? Not switch, not mostly. It entirely English. I am fluent in both Spanish and English, but I only think in English. Lol. Is it your original language or is Spanish? Spanish is my first language, but I don't really think in it much at all. I can think in them all. When I'm speaking a language, I think in that language even if I'm not 100% fluent. When I'm not speaking, I generally think in one of two languages I'm a native speaker in. I don't consciously control it. Sometimes I'm surrounded by one language and my brain randomly starts thinking in the other, but usually I'll think in the language I last used. I'm currently learning Swedish and it's gotten to the point where if I see an object, the Swedish word for it pops into my head before the English word does. It's a good thing. I am trying to become fluent. I often practice a lot of Swedish to myself. I sometimes practice on my boyfriend too. He's actually Swedish, but I'm still too embarrassed to try and have a full-blown Swedish conversation with him. One day. I am a slow learner, but I'm in the long game, and if I can become at least somewhat fluent in it, I'll be happy. First language, Danish. Second language, English. Third language, German. It switches between Danish and English. I'm Anglo and my French is fading, but when I'm super pissed I swear in Canadian French, if only in my head. I forced myself to think in Dutch when I was learning it. It's a good way to speed up learning a language. My first language is Swedish, but I'm fluent in English and pretty much only speak English at home. I can also understand Danish and Norwegian and speak a bit of French. I mostly think and dream in English unless I've been reading a lot of Swedish, or if I'm doing stuff where my vocabulary is lacking in English. While I was in seminary at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there was a professor there who was very skilled in languages. For example, he was planning a trip to Turkey to study something, and someone asked him why he was reading a book in German, and he said the best book on some specific part of the Turkish language is written in German. There was a story that might have been urban legend, but one day he was walking across the quad and the school president stopped him and said, "Dr. Gentry, how are things going?" "I'm disappointed." "Why?" "Because I know 9 languages, but can only think in 5 of them. My first language is Portuguese and I can speak a little bit of Spanish and I'm fluent in English. I'm not surrounded by people talking in English whatsoever, yet I mostly think in English. It makes no sense to me, but oh well. I consider myself to be fairly fluent in English. My thoughts partially switched to it when I was around 17 years old. I had been speaking a little English since I was 3, but I started seriously studying the language only when I turned 16. Currently, my inner monologue is both in English and in my native language. When I'm giving a speech in my head, discussing some concept with myself, I usually think in English. On the other hand, my inner voice uses my native language for the most of the mundane things, like my exams are tomorrow, yet here I am, browsing Reddit. Also, on some rare occasions, I hear nothing and just know what I'm thinking about. I live in America now, fluent in English, French, Bosnian, and Dutch. I always think in French. I was born and raised in France, so it's personally what I find more comfortable. I speak Portuguese, English, Spanish and German. In my house multiple languages were spoken in a mix at all times. Words in sentence weren't exactly from the same language. When I speak with my family like that, I think in no language in particular and it's second nature. When just speaking a single language at a time, I typically think in that language. When it comes to counting, it's mostly German. French when I speak French. English when I speak English. Sometimes English when I speak French. I'm French though. That's weird. Sometimes it's faster to just think in English rather than French, it seems. I started off thinking in English and then translating Spanish into English in my head. It took a lot of effort. The weirdest thing was when I started knowing words in Spanish that I didn't know in English. And then it was weird again when I started understanding Spanish words and sentences without having to consciously translate them into English first. It was like I would hear someone say something in Spanish and the understanding of the whole meaning of the sentence would pop into my head the same way as when someone said something in English. I learned English much earlier in life, so that's my default. But if I'm hearing Spanish or listening to Spanish music or media or even sometimes when I'm not, there are a lot of times when I think in Spanish, too. And honestly, I kind of prefer thinking in Spanish, but I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's that the music is better? I'm a native English speaker, but I speak French. While on holidays in France, I met a very interesting family. The father was French, and had a daughter from a previous relationship. The mother was English, and had a son from a previous relationship. Everyone in the family was fluent in both languages. Their conversations were wild, French and English mixed up completely. It was the weirdest linguistic experience of my life. Half the sentence would be in English, half in French. People would ask questions in one language and get an answer in the other. Sometimes one person would be speaking in French while the person they were speaking with replied in English. Being with them made my head hurt for the first day. After that I got used to it. Also, when I was returning from an extended period of time in France, my first instinct talking to air hostesses security was to speak French, even though I knew they didn't. But it was my habit. If I got woken up on the plane for dinner, I would start speaking in French before realizing I have to speak in English. I was trying to write a novel in English at the time and was struggling because my English was atrophied from lack of use. Even though I'm a native speaker, my friends noticed I developed a French accent too. These days I think in English, count in French, and swear in German. Dreams are mostly English, but sometimes French. Languages are weird, man. It's interesting to see so many people with English as their second or third language and they only think in English. Interesting stuff. I think that's just due to the world we live in right now. For me, I think either in the language I'm currently engaged in, for example reading the comments on here, I don't jump back to German as I'm writing this, or in a sort of in-between state. Sometimes it's less language and more like a series of pictures that form a coherent situation in my mind without any words in the mix. Sometimes I find myself with the question of, what language did I just think that in, and being unable to answer. After the fact you can put it into words, of course. My first language is English and second is French. I'm currently attempting to learn German, but every time I get stuck or can't think of the right German word, I start thinking in French. And I don't even speak French that well.
Thank you for watching Robot Radio. If you enjoyed and would like to watch more handpicked content, like and subscribe. Have a great day.